On this, the September 28th, 2025 edition of What the Ship, we look at the top 5 maritime stories. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. Don't adjust the color of your screen. It is this loud. That's right. This shirt from Hellcat Productions, a gift, is a very noticeable shirt. I like it. I like it a lot. My family, not so much, but I do enjoy it. Plus, decorated among here are F6F Grumman Hellcats, one of the greatest fighter planes of all times. So big shout out to Hellcat Productions. We're going to look at the top 5 maritime stories, but before we jump into that, we've got some recaps we need to update you about. First, over to the port of Long Beach, announced that at approximately 3:28 p.m. on September 26th, the final container was lifted from the water, marking the end of the salvage. However, it should be carefully noted here that Mississippi is still pierside at Pier G. Because of the collapse of the container stacks, salvage operations are ongoing on the vessel. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of containers that need to be removed from the vessel, and because of the shift of the cargo, that requires salvage operations. Plus, with the cargo that shifted in those containers, you have fear about fire and potentially hazardous material spills. Next, we head to the port of New York City, where the Mexican training ship Cuauhtémoc went underway for a sea trial. According to the New York Post, the Mexican naval ship that fatally smashed into the Brooklyn Bridge left for sea trials on Wednesday to test repairs. You may remember Cuauhtémoc, while leaving the port of Manhattan, engaged its engines, and instead of going ahead, the ship went astern and had a catastrophic strike on the Brooklyn Bridge. 2 of the naval cadets on board were killed. Over 20 were hospitalized. But the ship also suffered some damage. In particular, the stern ran into Brooklyn, the vessel grounded, and the 3 masts all toppled. At least the top of the masts were bent down. So the ship has been up in dry dock at Cattle Dry Dock and Repair in Staten Island, and now the vessel has completed its repairs and exercised a sea trial. The ship reported back into New York in Saturday. We expect it to be sailing back probably to Mexico or potentially continuing on its voyage and meet up with its naval cadets. The cadets who were on board flew back to Mexico and embarked on another vessel to conduct their training exercise. Next, we jump up into the Canadian Arctic, specifically the Northwest Passage. 2 salvage vessels have arrived in Canadian Arctic to begin refloating of the grounded Thamesborg. Thamesborg grounded on September 7th. She was sailing from China to Canada carrying a load of carbon blocks. The first of the 2 vessels dispatched sailed on September 9th from New Brunswick. This is the 450-ton tug Beverly MI, 4,000 horsepower, and a bollard pull of 71 tons. The second vessel is a Norwegian-flagged ice-class reefer cargo ship, the 4,230 deadweight-ton Silver Copenhagen. She sailed from the Baltic via Greenland. She's a 1B ice class, key to safely operating in the Canadian Arctic as winter sea ice will start to return. With a draft of just 6 meters, Silver Copenhagen will be able to pull up alongside Thamesborg to facilitate the transfer of the cargo. So planned here is to take that carbon off of Thamesborg, put it onto Silver Copenhagen, get the draft of Thamesborg up, and then the tug will be able to pull the vessel off and the voyage can be continued. They are racing against time. They're trying to beat ice forming up in the Northwest Passage. And then finally, we head down into the Caribbean to the coast of Venezuela. The U.S. buildup off the coast of Venezuela continues. Well, we still have that cruiser, the Lake Erie, but we have now 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. You have the submarine Newport News. Still have the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group down there with a embarked Marine Expeditionary Unit. We have assets, F-35s being based in Puerto Rico, and then supplement other ships have come down, including aircraft. We know that the MSC, Military Seal of Command underway replenishment ship, USNS Joshua Humphreys, had sailed from Jacksonville, Florida, after coming back across the Atlantic. She is down there to provide underway replenishment. That will allow the vessels to remain on station longer. There was a third strike initiated by the Trump administration against a suspected drug carrier down in the Caribbean. So we have seen an escalation in the number of strikes down in the region. We've also seen the deployment of a very unusual ship. You may remember last year I did a video on what I call the ultimate stealth ship in the U.S. military. That is the motor vessel Ocean Trader. I should mention that this video got me in a little bit of hot water with some people. They didn't like the fact that I did a video on this ship. However, I have to tell you, the ship is not a secret to many people. Number one, the ship has arrived down in the Caribbean, and I'm not giving away any top secret information here because the ship pulled into St. Croix, and really it's again, common knowledge. I mean, the ship is not hiding at all. It's been reported by multiple sources that the ship is down in the region. But the ship is operated by the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command for the Special Operations Command. When I did my video a year ago, I was talking about that we should be building more of these ships. And this is not new, by the way. I mean, I wrote a piece in SimSec back in 2017 on this vessel. And before everyone again gets all upset that I was releasing classified information, it came from a story released in 2016 over on the War Zone. So this ship, I think, is a great idea. I think it's a great idea to have these modified roll-on, roll-off ships outfitted so they can carry special operations forces, Marines, whatever we want on board, and we can use them in time of surge sea lift. I think we should have more Ocean Traders, not less. And I think we need to talk about it because it's not talked about enough in many ways. The arrival of Ocean Trader does signify a potential escalation. It can carry and support up to 200 special forces operators. And this is definitely seeing an uptick. I'm getting word that we may see more naval deployments down into the region. This is a pretty large force to be off the coast of Venezuela. And rumblings, rumors about deployments in and around the area. They're monitoring vessels coming in and out of Venezuela. This is going to provide a large sensor net and surveillance over the country of Venezuela. Now, we do know that Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, has wanting to start negotiations and conversations with President Trump to end this situation. All right, quick updates on those stories. We've been covering them extensively. Let's go ahead and jump into our first story. Story number one comes to us from Greg Miller over at Lloyd's List, counting the cost of Trump's tariffs to global growth and trade. So OECD experts global GDP to grow by 2.9% next year. Before Trump's tariffs, it was predicted to be 3.3%. Now, 0.4% doesn't sound like that much, but we're talking about global GDP. And even a single tenth of a percentage point is significant. U.S. GDP will grow by 1.4% next year, says Moody. If there had been no new tariffs, U.S. GDP would have grown by 2.6%. Now, again, these are all estimates that we're going on. Moody foresees a 2026 rally if the Supreme Court rules against the emergency tariffs and recession if full-scale trade war erupts. So a lot of debates going on about the impact of tariffs on the overall U.S. economy, and nobody can deny the fact that it is causing disruptions in the U.S. economy. We're seeing the fluctuations in the arrival of containers. We're not seeing the normal flows as we have, and the prediction is that the final quarter, Q4, is going to see a precipitous drop. John McCowan's report on container imports and many others are all foreseeing that. Now, we also see that in one particular sector. I'm heading down to beautiful Houston, Texas, next week to go give a keynote speech down at the Breakbulks America conference. So let's look at the breakbulk sector. Once again, Greg Miller over at Lloyd's List. Dry bulk entering fourth quarter with firm rate momentum. Now, ships come in different sizes here for the movement of bulk cargo. Now, bulkers are these large, massive vessels that carry grain and ore. In the case of Baltic Cape-size vessels, these are the ships that can only go around the Cape of Good Hope. The index is sitting at $30,000 roughly per day. For Panamax vessels, these are the vessels that can go through the Panama Canal, 16,484. And then the size just below that, Supermax, is at 16,664 per day. Now, Greg notes that U.S.-listed dry bulk shares are up around 30% to date, roughly double the pace of the broader stock market. But what we're about to see is an impact in U.S. exports. U.S. grain exports are sharply up in September, driven by corn largely, but volumes are expected to fall starting next month with the onset of soybean export season. So if we head over to one of my favorite reports, this is the USDA's grain transportation report. I really seriously need to get a life if one of my favorite reports is the USDA grain transportation report. If we look at the current shipped export sales for the 2025-2026 harvest year, we're looking at almost 11 million metric tons shipped. That is up over 8.5 million the previous year, about 128% increase. However, when you start breaking it down into the core commodities, you'll see corn is up just a bit, but notice that the top 5 importers do not show China at all in corn imports. When you look at soybeans, so far the year to date for 2025-2026, 0 for soybeans heading into China. China is sourcing their soybeans from other sources, Brazil, Argentina, a few others. That's obviously going to be a major impact on the ability to import that. And what we're seeing is soybean exports so far are down 10% from the previous year. You can see the same thing in terms of U.S. exports of wheat to China. However, it is not as significant as other areas, and actually wheat exports are up 9%. So obviously tariffs having an impact. We knew there's going to be reciprocal effects against the United States. We saw the same thing in the first Trump administration when China did the similar thing about importing U.S. grain. We had to do a bailout for farmers. President Trump talked about this just the other day. So we may see something similar on the way for farmers. However, one of the things we're seeing is that U.S. farmers are shifting their trade in where those exports are going, but soybeans is going to be the real big issue. Story number 2 deals with the United States and the International Maritime Organization and their net zero framework for shipping. Story over in GCAP by Mike Scholler. The maritime industry faces mounting tension over decarbonization as the American Bureau of Shipping Chairman and CEO Christopher Wernicke has called for the International Maritime Organization to pause and reconsider its net zero framework, highlighting significant concerns about implementation feasibility. Now, these comments come at a really critical moment because there is scheduled to be the formal adoption of the net zero framework in October of 2025, mid-October, with implementation scheduled for 2027. Where Wernicke emphasized that the industry requires, quote, a framework that marries ambition with reality, noting that the mechanics need to be thought through. He pointed out that emissions remain 121% above the 2008 baseline, while compliance costs continued to expand. The latest ABS sustainability outlook reveals that despite progress on carbon intensity, shipping absolute emissions continue to climb. The report models how a typical vessel trading within the EU could see daily operating costs increase approximately $15,000 in 2028 to around $45,000 by 2035. Wernicke articulated a 3-part approach to maritime decarbonization: 70% fuel selection, 15% fuel efficiency, and 15% performance optimization. The ABS chief advocated for protecting the bridge, LNG with methane slip controls and credible bio-LNG pathways, while extending the runway through energy efficiency technologies and onboard carbon capture. Same time, Bloomberg puts this story out. Major shipping firms warn net zero plan could cost over $300 billion by 2035. Then you have the port industry warns of a disaster if the IMO net zero framework fails the October vote. The International Association of Ports and Harbors has issued an urgent call for IMO member states to adopt a net zero framework at the upcoming extraordinary MEPC meeting in mid-October, warning that failure could derail the maritime industry's energy transition and leave developing nations behind. Okay, you got 2 issues going on here. Number 1, IMO is on track to really want to get by 2050 net zero carbon emissions on shipping. Again, ships are the largest objects ever made by humans. And so to get them to get to net zero is a tough accomplishment when we can't even do planes, trains, and automobiles. Second, the Trump administration does not like IMO dictating this. And so the Trump administration and the United States has been the first really to buck against this. However, once the U.S. did that, it started a cascade of other groups doing it. Shipping companies, now we have the American Bureau of Shipping, which is a classification agency, and other entities and organizations are pushing back against the IMO. Now, the IMO wants to make this change. The problem is they have not yet figured out ways to make this change. And there are some groups who want it for their own purposes. China, for example, pushes very heavily for this net zero, not because they are great at emissions control. Just go to China and you can see they're not. The reason they want this is because it will facilitate and fuel more shipbuilding, because you have to start replacing older ships that are being subjected to these regulations. I will note this, as a mariner and talking to mariners out there, they are terrified over some of these fuels that are being advocated to be used on ships. One in particular, ammonia. Ammonia scares the crap out of people. It really does. Yes, ammonia is efficient. It doesn't have a carbon release. However, having supercooled, pressurized ammonia on a ship is extremely dangerous. What happens when you have an accident with ammonia on board a ship? I have to tell you, ships carry ammonia for refrigeration purposes, and when you have ammonia leaks, you at times have to evacuate the ship. You have to leave it alone, because not only is it explosive, it's corrosive. You can't go into an ammonia-rich environment. It is absolutely hazardous. And what they're advocating for right now is to put ammonia as a fueling source. The other problem you have is you need fueling sources for ammonia. We have just seen the outfitting of an LNG system around the world to get liquefied natural gas on ships. What they want to do with the IMO is not use LNG as an interim fuel source. They're talking about getting rid of that when the U.S. and other nations have adopted LNG. This is a big mess. And one of the things the United States and other nations need to do is to go into the IMO and not just halt the net zero. I'm not talking about killing net zero, but they need to have a more realistic plan at work here in how to adopt it, because right now they are not achieving their goals. All right, let's go ahead to our next story. Story number 3 kind of builds on our first story, where we have another story from our buddy Greg Miller over at Lloyd's List. Man, Greg is the man. Rise and fall of container spot rates and what it means for 2026. So the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index, SCFI, Shanghai to U.S. West Coast Index, has dropped to just $1,460 per FEU. That's a 40-foot equivalent unit, 2 TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units. The lowest price since July 7th, 2023. Spot rate assessments for east-west lanes by multiple indexes providers have fallen back to price levels that predate the Red Sea crisis. Supply dynamics for carriers are worse now than they were prior to the Houthi attacks, underscoring the need for capacity management. Okay, Greg, what does that mean? For that, we go over to Linton Nightingale, one of the best names in maritime shipping. Also over at Lloyd's, BIMCO warns of turbulence as liner overcapacity looms large. Container shipping faces mounting headwinds as 2025 draws to a close. Freight rates are poised to decline amid surging fleet capacity and softening demand. BIMCO warns that structural imbalances could spill into the charter and sale and purchase markets. All right, let's break that down with a series of charts by Alpha Liner. So the first here tracks the percentage of profitability of all the major container carriers. And if it goes all the way back here to 2011, if you look at the years from 2011 up until 2020, ocean carriers, particularly container liners, really were not being very profitable. You'll see as many years of over 0% as under 0%. So it really wasn't very profitable. And then 2020 happened, the global supply chain crisis. And they made a buttload of money, so much so that they made more profit in 2020 than they did in the entire decade before, from 2011 up until 2019. And then they made more profit in 2021. And then they made almost as much profit again in 2022. But then in 2023, we see that profit fall. And they actually went into the negative here at the very end of 2023. And then the Houthi emerged with this huge diversion around Africa that made everything profitable again. But now we see that number coming down. And the question we have is, okay, why is that number coming down? Because the Houthi are still diverting. We still have 70% of the tonnage going through the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, cheers, and the Gulf of Aden going around. Well, to answer that, we go to a second chart from Alpha Liner. This shows you the container ship order book in terms of vessels and sizes. And one of the things you see here are really these huge number of orders going in for vessels. We have a massive order book going on for containers, particularly on the large size of vessels. So we're seeing all these vessels come in. You also notice that many of these ships are using those new fuels that we talked about earlier, LNG, methanol, and even some hydrogen-powered vessels in here. Now, the reason we see so many container ships being ordered is because the container liners got the profits from 2020 to 2023. Well, if you're a sailor drunk with money, you will spend it. Take my word for it. I did it many times. So they're buying themselves new ships, and those new ships are entering the fleet now, and they're creating what we're calling this overcapacity. Now, when you have overcapacity, you expect ships to go away. The problem is they're not going away. Third chart here from Alpha Liner showing the container ship idle fleet per size and operating groups. And you'll see back into 2020, we had a idling fleet there. A lot of them were idled because of what was happening, but then all of a sudden they found their employment. And what has not happened is the massive scrapping of vessels. And that is in this fourth chart here. You look at scrappings being done. We saw an uptick in 2023 when everyone was looking at a slowdown coming on, but then that was curtailed and we barely scrapped anything in 2025. Nowhere near the huge number of ships we saw scrapped after the economic recession of 2008 or in the mid-2010s. All of that means is the large container liners, remember the 10 biggest container liners in 4 groupings control 85% of all the world's container capacity, have to reshuffle and rethink what they're doing. Now, they're going to scream low freight rates. Now, a couple of things not noted in the articles. Number one, we're coming into Golden Week. This is a period of holiday over in China. Always see a drop off here at this time. That always happens, and we see freight rates come down. But most freight rates are brokered and set at 2 different times during the year. Most freight rates are long-term freight rates. What you're seeing here is the spot rates. Those are the ones you get at the last minute. Those are the ones you get to kind of fill up your capacity when you can't do a long-term necessity. And those are always fluctuating all over the place. The question is really going to be after this year when we see the tariffs take effect, and we're talking about those low Q4 numbers, what is it going to look like coming out of this year into 2026? And this is the fear, is that we're going to see a bottoming out of the container numbers, which means that the container liners are going to start laying up vessels. They'll blank sailing. They'll cancel voyages to try to keep the freight rates up high. The container companies will always say they don't manipulate the rates, but they do a lot to control the rates. And so they have capacity to do that by laying up ships and blank sailings. All right, let's go to our fourth story. Story number 4 is going to lead us right into story number 5, and it deals with this Malt Humbert over at G Captain. Russia opens new production line at Sanctioned Arctic LNG 2 as the first carrier loads cargo. Russia continues to expand its Arctic liquefied natural gas facilities. More than a year after towing the second production line to the Gdynia Peninsula, a gas carrier berthed at Train 2 of the Arctic LNG 2 project for the first time. Ice-class LNG carrier Christopher de Margerie, originally built for the neighboring Yamal LNG project, called at the Utreni terminal on September 22nd. The loading signals that Novatek, the plant's majority owner, has overcome initial startup problems resulting in part from the need to replace original gas turbines with an electric drive. The startup of the second train comes just weeks after Moscow, for the first time, found a buyer for sanctioned LNG cargoes from the plant. For more than a year, up to 1 million tons of supercooled gas remained afloat in the absence of buyers. In late August, LNG carrier Arctic Milan made the first delivery to Pipe China's Benham terminal. 5 additional offloadings have followed in quick succession, with several more vessels en route. Then you have this story over at Lloyd's List. The last thing shipping needs is a Shadow Fleet 2.0. Loading boxes in occupied China or lifting oil from Libya's military strongmen doesn't pass the smell test. Story goes, the presidents of Ukraine and Panama got together at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, UNGA, this week, with the Shadow Fleet inevitably the main topic up for discussion. Jose Raul Molino assured Vladimir Zelensky that his country, the world's largest open registry, Panama, had revoked registration of 200 tankers contravening sanctions on the export of Russian crude. Consoling as Zelensky will have found the affirmation, Panama's stance will do little to staunch prohibited trade, not just with Russia, but with Iran and Venezuela as well. Attempts to put the guilty operators out of business have proved more than a game of flag state whack-a-mole, with plenty of bottom-feeding flags of conveniences offering alternative home ports on a no-question basis. Okay, so here we have Russian Arctic LNG in violation of sanctions being leveled against them by the EU and G7. And I know they're not international sanctions, they're not condoned by the UN, but this is the G7 and the EU protesting against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has stepped up quite a bit with attacks against oil and port facilities in both countries. Here we see Russian LNG being shipped via the Arctic route across northern Russia here to China and coming through the Bering Sea and into the ports of China. And then this story about a Shadow Fleet 2.0, this has involved trade and coming out of Russia, cargo coming out of Libya. One of the fears I have is that we're seeing the bifurcation, the splitting of the world's merchant fleet into not just two composing opposite forces here, the Shadow Fleet, the Dark Fleet, whatever you want to call it, and then those that are being regulated by the previous post whatever period time we're talking about today is, to a much more dangerous area. And with that, this morphs us into the fifth story. Good friend of the show, Tomer Renan over at Lloyd's List. Smoke spotted from gas tanker off Yemen amid reports of drone strikes in the Houthi ports. An LPG carrier anchored off Ras Isa caught fire last week for reasons that are not entirely clear. The Houthis, HOCC, said that the crew were in good condition, but an appeal on social media said they were running out of supplies and under life-threatening circumstances. Explosions have been reported around the Houthi port in recent weeks. Houthis are keeping a tight lid on information. Then you have this story out from Reuters. Gaza flotilla sails again. An international aid flotilla that paused for several days in Greek waters for repairs had set sail again for Gaza, where activists aim to challenge Israel's naval blockade and deliver aid to the Palestinian territory. Organizers said on Sunday that Greek vessels have now joined their enterprise, meaning the flotilla, which counts some 47 civilian boats, was complete. The flotilla was struck on Wednesday in international waters off Crete by drones armed with stun grenades and irritants. Follows a second attack by drones off of Tunisia. We don't know who did it. There are various claims out here. But Italian and Spain have deployed naval ships close to the flotilla. We have already talked about the third strike by the United States against the Venezuelans, with this strike killing 3 people. And my concern is that, much like what Ian Urbina wrote about a while ago with the Outlaw Ocean, we are turning the world's oceans into an outlaw ocean because rules don't seem to be applying to everybody equally. Listen, I will sit there till I'm red in the face screaming about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Not because I'm a big fan of UNCLOS or the United Nations. It's the law of the sea. It's what everyone has agreed to, except for the United States and Venezuela and a few other countries. But the vast majority of the world's nations have agreed to it, and even the United States says they abide by UNCLOS. The fear I see happening here is a complete and utter breakdown of what's happening on the high seas. I could throw into this, by the way, what the Chinese and the Philippines are doing in the South China Sea as another example. We could talk about anchor drags up in the Baltic, 60 Minutes. As a matter of fact, we'll have a special about that tonight, talking about the Eagle S. All of this, and again, I try to apply the rules fairly. I call out the Houthis when they violate UNCLOS. I talked about the Israelis boarding vessels out in international waters. They can't preemptively board a vessel before it enters their waters or Gaza waters. They can't do that. The U.S. has to show the reasons for the attacks against vessels in international waters, against suspected Venezuelan drug runners. I mean, again, I'm going to call out everyone here. You have to follow the rules of the sea, because understand, if you break down the rules of the sea, then what our entire global trade system is built on is going to start coming apart at the seams. Just had the latest version of the review of maritime transport coming out. I'm going to talk about that. But one of the big problems they talked about are these threats to global commerce. I mean, we went from shipping 500 million tons of cargo in 1950 to shipping over 12 billion tons of cargo in 2024. We're seeing that increase exponentially almost every year. This will cause it to stop, because if all of a sudden you start blowing up ships and you start putting navies back out on the blue ocean threatening shipping, that's going to change everything, including forces ashore. It has the potential to start disrupting global trade. We're already seeing it. I mean, the Houthi have demonstrated how they can shift 10% of the global trade around Africa. They're a non-state actor. They represent one part of a 3-way civil war in Yemen. Other nations can do that too, and we can see it happen even more. This is my fear. And when nations take rules into their own hand, they say you have to apply these rules to this group, but then they don't apply the same rules to themselves. that tends to be a problem. And I am a big advocate for free trade, for the blue ocean common, for allowing ships to go. Understand, one of the things the United States did after World War II, when it controlled 63% of the world's trading fleet, is sit there and say, hey, we're going to rebuild our allied nations. We're going to rebuild nations we went to war with. We're going to help the Japanese. We'll eventually help the Europeans, including the Germans. We'll help the Koreans. And we allowed that to prosper and grow while we focused on building and maintaining a large U.S. Navy to protect the global commons. Well, guess what? We don't have a large Navy. We have the biggest Navy in the world, but it's nowhere as big as it once was. It's overstretched, overburdened, and just, under-resourced. And you can't do everything. You need other nations to do this. And when the world's largest registries are open registries, Liberia, Panama, and the Marshall Islands, then when trade is threatened, who's going to protect them? Who's going to go out? The U.S. had a, successful tactical operation in the Red Sea, but strategically, operationally, it failed because trade is still being routed around Africa. And what we're seeing right now is the impact of that. Add to it tariffs and all the other events we're superimposing on global trade. It is a big moment of flux for global trade. I think Ian or Bina may need to write the Outlaw Ocean 2.0. Or maybe I'll do that. Maybe I will take some time and write a book. I don't think I have time to do that, but I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Well, you give it a big thumbs up. You can hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. Or if you really want to support the show and you want to do something to keep this show going, send colorful shirts. I mean, come on, this is great. I've been enamored staring at myself for this entire episode at this shirt. I mean, it is hypnotizing, I must say. Big shout out to Hellcat Productions and the crew down in Pensacola for sending it out. It has Pensacola right there, Pensacola Beach on it right there. Love Pensacola, one of my favorite places. Till next episode, this is Sal, signing off.